delighted. I'm happy that you have invited me to this forum. It's a good opportunity for me to share some of my thoughts. And let me admit, what I'll be speaking on, I'm in the process of writing it down. So you may some portions of my thought still unorganized a bit. You can call it raw, not cooked, as Levi-Strauss described, the raw and the cooked. It's raw, it's not much cooked, but it's about food. So in any form, I hope we will share some of my ideas, and I'll be happy to listen to your comments, your observations on the topic. It's about what I'm doing recently. Svetlana knows it well. I'm working on anthropology of food, and Svetlana was kind enough to write a chapter in a volume edited by me. It's about food and power, the politics of food in South Asia. And she has written an excellent chapter there on food as symbol. Now, let me share my thoughts with you. And as Svetlana has said that I may take much time, but I won't take much time because I'm talking about something that has not been written, that has not been worked upon. Title of my presentation is Anna Saṃhita, or the Shastra of Food, the treatise that was never written. So it's about something non-existent. So let me share my ideas with you. There are innumerable issues related to food, and those can be, or rather, those must be examined at least from 3 dimensions. What we call sthan, kal, and patra, the time, space, and actors. So it's very important that we keep all the 3 dimensions in mind while discussing any dimension of culture, and especially so for food. Because whatever hierarchy we can see in South Asian society or elsewhere in all over the world, it's very universal kind of a thing. It is immediately reflected through food practices. You rank people on basis of what they eat and what they prefer to eat and what they do not eat. People are ranked, people are identified on basis of that. So all these 3 items, 3 issues, or 3 axes I would rather call, time, space, and actor, are important for this discussion. Texts composed by Vedic and post-Vedic Indians. Now, I can go back more in time. I'll do that later. The Vedic and post-Vedic Indians show they were primarily consumers of food and distinguished themselves from food producers. I'm talking of the scholars, the Brahmins, the Vedic Brahmins, the post-Vedic Brahmins, those who were composing. I mean, I don't mean the Varna system was there all through. No, it was not, but whoever was writing those texts are being referred to as Brahman, those who have understood Brahma. So they were basically consumers of food and not producers of food, because rarely they describe the process of food production and food processing. They only discuss the raw material of food they eat or others used to eat as consumers. There is a prayer in Yajurveda composed in about 800 BC asking for food in abundance. Let me quote, "May for me prosper through the sacrifice honey, eating and drinking at the common table, plowing, rain, conquest, victory, wealth, riches. May for me prosper through the sacrifice, low-grade food, freedom from hunger, rice, barley, sesame, kidney beans, vetches, wheat, lentils, millet, panicum grains, and wild rice. May for me prosper through the sacrifice, trees, plants, that which grows in plowed land and that which grows in the unplowed land, the cultivated and the non-cultivated. They are making a distinction. They have referred to wild rice and all that, but they are asking for prosperity in food, but they are not getting into the nitty-gritties of the process of production. Nowhere. We find a different approach towards food elsewhere in Yajurveda. The same text, the same Veda refers to food elsewhere, mentions food rather elsewhere. It's Taittiriya Upanishad, which was composed in around 600 BC. The text contains a narrative known as Vargavi Varuna Vidya, involving Vrigu and Varun, the two protagonists. When Vrigu inquired from his father Varun about Brahma, the supreme entity, Varun told his son that he can realize the truth about Brahma only through penance. He has to carry out his sadhana to understand Brahma. Vrigu followed his father's advice and came to know, or he realized, Anna or food is Brahma. All beings originate from Anna. It keeps them alive. Beings move towards Anna and in the end merge with Anna. When Vrigu told his father about his realization, Varun advised the young man to continue with his penance further. It was incomplete. His realization was faulty. Vrigu did so and realized life is Brahma. Varun was not happy and asked his son to carry on with his effort further. This time, Vrigu realized mind is Brahma. Again, his father was not satisfied and asked Vrigu to resume the penance. Vrigu did so and finally realized happiness is Brahma. And his father agreed to that. So, here, through this tale, through this narrative, some kind of ordering is being done. Happiness is on top, followed by mind, then life, and at the bottom of this whole exercise is anna, or food. And those who are involved in production of food are placed at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The Taittiriya narrative makes it clear that Brahman scholars were not required to spend much time thinking about food. It was not a prime concern for them, to say nothing about their participation in the process of procurement or production of food. Therefore, their scholastic priorities could exclude thoughts about victuals, about food to a large extent. In post-Vedic period, scholars composed Brahma Sutra and even Kama Sutra, Artha Shastra, but never Anna Sutra or Anna Saṃhita. No treatise, no Shastra about food alone. It was actually excluded from the list of philosophical inquiries. Food has often remained a symbol of cosmic relations, not food in as object, but it was a symbol of cosmic relations for ancient Hindus. Vedantic literature describes human soul that has been granted salvation and allowed to roam around in the universe, freed from the bodily existence. The soul is now free. It can roam around the universe freely at its own will and chant joyously, I am food, I am an eater of food. That is the free soul that can chant. I am the food, I am the eater of food. So it's a dual existence, free from the encumbrance of physical existence. Elsewhere, creation myths describe Agni or fire to have originated from mouth of Brahma, the creator, and Agni is eater of food. So sacrifice in a yajna, sacrifice is made to Agni, milk and butter are offered as oblation to fire. That is how it eats, because it is the eater. And sometimes, for a change, it devours an entire forest for, just to get a different taste in mouth. So fire sometimes burn down entire forests. There is a tale, Khandabdahan, in Mahabharata. Throughout prehistoric and proto-historic period, now, as I was telling you, if we change our level, it's all about sthan, kal, and patra. If we change our level, look at the myths of origin in Ostrich languages, the earliest inhabitants of the land called India, the Ostrich speakers. In Santal lore of Genesis, the creator, the supreme creator, created humans, and later when they had a large population and could not sustain simply on hunting and gathering from wild resources, they had to produce food, and there is a detailed description how the supreme creator facilitated food production. So there is a long tale about how food was produced in Santal myths of Genesis, but it is not there in Vedic or post-Vedic literature. That is one point. Throughout prehistoric and protohistoric period, later the Vedic people and others consumed animal food regularly. Vedas mention not less than 250 animals that were eaten. 50 or those were considered fit for sacrifice to gods. Some of the edible animals were domesticated. Others were wild creatures hunted by professional hunters. There were fishers who netted fish and turtle. There used to be meat stalls at marketplace selling beef, mutton, pork, meat of hunted and trapped games like deer, fowl, alligator, and tortoise. Space for cattle slaughtering was known as Garaghatanam, and those for swine was known as Shukarasanam. This is post-Vedic literature. If you look at Manu Saṃhita, he makes a list, or rather ranks food, items of food, which make the deceased persons, when somebody is performing, the family is performing funeral rites for a person, food is offered. And which food can make your ancestors most happy, he has made a list and ranked the food. For example, fish is at the bottom. It's mostly about animal food. Fish is at the bottom and then goes up in along the ladder of different kinds of meat, and at the top is black buck, the deer. That is the best meat one can offer to ancestors. And among rice, non-cultivated rice, nibar dhan, they say, non-cultivated rice is the best cereal one can offer to the ancestors. So we get a food preference from consumer's viewpoint in Manu Saṃhita. Later, consumption of eating meat and drinking alcohol or abstinence from those items became related to, were connected with social ranking. So appropriateness of consuming meat and alcohol occupied significant space in Indian literature from ancient to recent times, and not just post-Vedic literature, Jain and Buddhist literature especially, but if you come to recent times, in 1930s, in 1940s, Indian nationalists were talking about appropriateness of eating non-vegetarian food. And there were there were debates in different parts of the country between different schools of nationalist politicians, and they were arguing over these items, appropriateness of consuming all these items of food and beverages, of course. And they were trying to determine which makes you more Indian, if you eat meat or if you abstain from meat. However, the scholars never preferred to write down recipes of food consumed either by us or by them, because in post-Vedic or Vedic literature, it's always between us and them. Manu Saṃhita, it's us and them. We eat these and we do not eat these. The filthy people, the lowly people, they eat those items. We must not eat those items. So it's always between us and them. But all through, throughout this millennia, they never ever wrote down any recipe book, any cookbook. So the knowledge about, we sometimes discuss what was Somrasa. In Veda, it is mentioned in post-Vedic literature, somewhere it is mentioned, it finds some mention, Somrasa. But we do not know what was that, because nowhere the process of its procurement, now we are told that it's a wild plant and possibly a creeper, and how the liquor was extracted from it, we are not sure about it. So, and we are not sure about the raw material as well. For the first time, recipe books were written in India during the reign of various Turkish, Afghan, and Central Asian dynasties, collectively known as Delhi Sultanate, preceding the Mughal period. That was the first time some cookbooks were written in India. And they ruled large parts of northern India between 973 and 1526 CE, that is before present. The sultans were known for entertaining their guests with elaborate fare, the way the Shahs of Persia did. The detailed accounts of such banquets are available for the first time in Indian literature. Though most of the food were of West Asian origin, Indian dishes were adopted, especially khichdi of rice and moong dal with ghee. Another form of Indian influence could be noted in increase in number of vegetarian dishes in the menu of the sultans. By early 15th century, Delhi Sultanate became weak and broke down in smaller kingdoms. Those kingdoms enlisted hundreds of recipes, each one of them, because Delhi Sultanate was becoming weak and local smaller kings were becoming stronger. So the cooks, the chefs from Delhi were migrating to smaller towns and serving the smaller kings. And each one of them in turn were developing their own fare of food, their own signature dishes, and some chroniclers were writing those down. They were experimenting with food and those were being written down. Now, Some dishes mentioned in the book are, I'm sorry, several dishes carry Persian and Turkic names, while some others are of indigenous origin. Some dishes mentioned in the books are bracketed under Ganvari or Garib category, what the poor people eat. Synthesis of different civilizations was taking place in kitchens and on dining tables. The process continued during Mughal rule over large part of India. Appadurai, Arjun Appadurai, has related availability of Mughlai cuisine, which in India has been equated with Islamic cuisine, with spread of political hegemony of Mughal rulers in the subcontinent. He has argued such cuisine is largely rooted in Turco-Afghan traditions and borrowed some elements from peasants of North Indian plains. So it can be considered as an important step towards Indian cuisine, but does not represent entire subcontinent, as it derives nothing of significance from various regional cuisines beyond north. It could never become a pan-Indian cuisine because you don't find any inclusion of the typical South Indian cuisine. I mean, there are different schools, there are different ways of cooking food there, and those were never included in Mughal cuisine. So Appadurai argues that there was and there still is not any national cuisine for India. In a lighter vein, some other scholars have argued that, well, on one count, Appadurai is wrong. There is one national dish in India, only one, and that's khichdi. Because all over India, in odd food cultures, people eat khichdi, and those who came from outside, be the Turco-Afghans, be the Mughals, be the Europeans, they adopted khichdi. And all these chroniclers say that for the rulers from different countries, khichdi was the most popular breakfast all through these centuries. So accepting that, we agree with Arjuna Appadurai that India could never develop a national cuisine. Cookbooks were written by Indians that was much later, during the colonial period, when the English educated Bhadralok reached almost every part of India to serve the Raj as British government employees. They moved out to different parts of the country, the Bhadralok people, the English educated people, and they started writing down cookbooks because the housewives, many hundreds of thousand miles away from home, required some kind of a guidance into standard ways of cooking. So cookbooks were written, and mostly written in English. And these people who moved out, they were exposed to Indian cuisine in different parts of India, mostly the regional cuisines, as well as to European cuisines. Consequently, their kitchens became more cosmopolitan. Ladies of such households were supposed to learn cooking from native Brahman dishes on one hand, along with some Mughlai and Western fare. Both they tried to learn, and the ideal kitchen of a Bhadralok should be able to cater all such dishes to their guests. The issue became part of the nationalist politics, which I mentioned once. In different parts of India, cookbooks were published in vernacular. This is the first time as part of nationalist politics. So it has been related to nationalist politics by some, that cookbooks were being written in vernacular languages to advise young women in culinary skills and indigenous culinary skills. They should learn Indian cooking. So cookbooks were written for them in vernacular. Indian cuisines in different parts of India, as well as, all these books carry some description of some European dishes as well. Consequently, they're okay. On one hand, such publications define their role as homemaker, how to train them to become good housewives. On the other, the cookbooks highlighted distinction between Indian and European cuisines and cultures. The trend was, it was again reported by Appadurai as well as by a food historian, Professor Jayant Sengupta. Another issue which I have mentioned briefly is the debate between vegetarianism versus non-vegetarianism appeared in discourses of the nationalists, often with reference to Western habit of eating meat. Now, this was a crucial issue for them. You have to be Indian to become a nationalist in your culture, in your food practices. How to do that? Some argued that you have to be vegetarian. But then others criticized, because earlier the British, in their early days of colonial government, they criticized Indians as effeminate. Their vegetarianism, their habit of eating small portions, make them more feminine than masculine. That is what the British used to describe, the way British used to describe Indian food practices. So this counter argument was among nationalists that you have to eat a lot and you have to eat meat to become masculine, because you have to struggle against colonialism, and they represent some kind of masculinity in their food culture. So that debate continued among nationalists. In absence of a national cuisine, in true sense of the term, let us examine the regional and sub-regional trends found in cookbooks. There is rarely any cookbook, a standard cookbook, that will tell you about national cuisine, which Appadurai has said it was absent, and we have more or less agreed to that. But then the regional and sub-regional trends were clearly visible in the cookbooks, especially those written in vernacular. And those were written since late 19th century. For that reason, the Indian state of Maharashtra has been, I have discussed here, the Indian state of Maharashtra, what cookbooks written there were telling us the story of regionalism and sub-regionalism and connecting it with Indianness. To understand that, one has to understand the intricacies of Maharashtra, of being a Maharashtrian. Maharashtra is traditionally divided into 5 geocultural zones on basis of history and topography. Those are Konkan, Western Maharashtra or Desh, Marathwada, Khandesh, and Vidarbha. Those zones display wide range of geographical as well as cultural variations, which are reflected in Marathi food too. In each zone, again, food practices of different religious and caste groups show variation. It's a mind-boggling complexity. There are regions, and each region, castes and religious groups have their own kind of food, own variety of food. cookbooks can shed some light on their inter and intra-zonal variations. Since late 19th century, publication of books and magazines for nascent urban middle-class Indians took place. In 19th century, some books on household management were published in Maharashtra that contained recipes. Basically, those were guidebooks for household management, and there were chapters on, portions on cooking. Later in 20th century, some identity crisis among sections of urban middle class was noted. This class was largely represented by upper and middle ranking Hindu castes. They started suffering from identity crisis, not the lower ones who were mostly food producers. A compilation of Sarasat Brahman cuisine, that's a subcaste among the Maharashtrian Brahmins, Sarasat Brahmins. A cookbook was published it was called Rasachandrika. It was published in 1940s, and it was a cookbook describing Sarasat Brahman cooking. Because their idea was, they apprehended that with the ongoing nationalist movement, with the effort to make everything national from regional, their own way of cooking, their subcaste way of cooking will get lost. So it must be documented now. It was some identity issue for them. So to stop that nationalistic identity subsuming regional, religious, and cultural identities, they made various efforts, and cookbooks were a part of it. This book, Rasachandrika, was published in 1940s. Though there were several cookbooks on cuisine of a specific, it was not in isolation that such a book by a subcaste was prepared. Various other castes and subcastes started writing their own cookbooks in Maharashtra. And this trend continues. I will give you one example. Though there were several cookbooks on cuisine of a specific caste or subcaste or ethnic group of Maharashtra, many publications made in recent years include cuisines from different caste groups and zones, geographical zones within the state. Let us consider one such publication. Author of this cookbook has presented cuisines from several parts of the state and from different communities. It's a compilation of cuisines from different parts of the state, and the contributors have been named. And against the name of each contributor, the region, the religion, the caste, and the subcaste has been mentioned. And it's a recent publication, mind that. Not a book published in 1930s or 40s. And I have examined that list, and among the contributors, there are Konkanastha, Deshastha, and Swarasat Brahmins, 3 types of Brahmins. Maratha, Pathare Prabhu, Chandraseniya Kayastha Prabhu, and Sonar from among the Hindus, and East Indian Christians and Muslims from among non-Hindus. Selection of contributors, at least in this case, falls very well within the scheme noted by Appadurai. All of them, barring the exception of Muslim and Christians, belong to high and middle ranking Hindu castes, and possibly to cosmopolitan urban middle class milieu, the English educated urban cosmopolitan section of the society. It was authored by them and to be used by them, such cookbooks. Remarkably, and here is the absence, remarkably, there is no representation of any Dalit community of the state. While we know that Dalit movement is so strong in Maharashtra from the very beginning, but still, and they have tried to assert themselves culturally and otherwise, but never ever in such cookbooks there is any mention about the Dalit groups. There is no contributor from those groups and no cuisine of those groups. Food practices of those groups are ever mentioned. Indian society is divided on basis of religious affiliation and hierarchy of castes. Pure vegetarian Brahmins are placed at the top. Of course, this is the Brahman perspective of looking at it. Non-vegetarians who abstain from eating beef in the middle and all beef eaters at the bottom. It has been claimed 70% of Indian beef eaters are not majority in India, but from among beef eaters, 70% of them are from scheduled castes, the Dalit, and scheduled tribes. 21 of them are from other backward castes or OBCs, and 7% belong to upper castes, the cosmopolitan. There, 7% of the beef eaters, 93% are the Dalits, the scheduled tribes and castes. Varna or caste groups placed on top of Hindu social order considered certain items of food as unclean or unhygienic, which often are source of nourishment for groups placed in the bottom by them, especially the Dalit. While food eaten by the former groups are well known and documented, till very recent times, little or no information was available on what members of Dalit communities eat. And literally, I'm telling you, literally, the rest of India knew very little about what these lowly placed Dalit communities used to eat and still eat. Specifically, I will mention a book here. A book was published in 2015, again in Marathi language from Aurangabad. This was a food on book of the Hmong. These Hmong people are also known as Matang, and they can be compared with the Chamar of North India. They are the hide workers and they eat carrion. They are a Dalit community of Maharashtra. In contrast to the cosmopolitan and urban middle class communities, the Hmong are rural wage workers, rope makers, village musicians, and midwives. At some places, they used to remove dead animals, especially dead cattle, and were hide workers, used to de-skin the dead animals and recycle those hides, the skin, especially for shoemaking industry. This is manifest in the fact that they live in separate settlement in villages. The term untouchable should not be, according to the constitution and penal codes, should not be used for any community in India, but they were made to live outside the village separately. Several dishes mentioned in the book on Hmong food were beyond the idea of good food listed in hitherto published cookbooks from Maharashtra or from rest of the country. Sahu Patole, a Hmong himself, he is author of this book, wrote the book in vernacular that some of the neighboring communities, the Hmong were eating pudding made of coagulated blood of animals. The meat is eaten by rich people and the coagulated, the solidified blood is collected by the Hmong, was collected by the Hmong and cooked as a dish, was unknown to their neighbors, their high and middle caste neighbors. And dishes were made of epiglottis, a portion, that is the throat portion, which was thrown away by others, was a delicacy for the monks. Uh, Somewhere, Shahu Patole has narrated a story. It's common among the monks, but possibly for the very first time, through his book, others came to know about this story, and it's known to all monks in Maharashtra. A poor person from the monk community, he was arrested by police and taken to the king's court because there was some theft somewhere and they could not catch the thief. So the first thing they did, the poorest person they came across was arrested, produced before the court, and the police told that he is the culprit. And the court ordered that the person be hung by neck till death, what in Hindi called phasi. This poor man could understand nothing of the proceedings, was standing aloof, almost aloof in the court. But at the end, somebody explained to him that he will be given phasi hoga. He will be given phasi. And the person became very happy. He started almost dancing in joy. And he said, phasi, phasi, oh, I'm so happy. Phasi after so many days. Then the person, probably was a lawyer, asked him again, do you understand what I mean to say? He said, yes, you said, I'll be given phasi. He then said, what is phasi? He said, okay, you do not know. That's a dish. That's a food we eat. It's so popular among monks. It's actually the entrails that is thrown away by richer people. The monks collect it and make some dish with it, and that in their vocabulary is called phasi. So when he was told that he will be given phasi, the order is for phasi, he was overjoyed. He has narrated this tale to illustrate the gap in our knowledge. For some, phasi is death. For this poor monk, phasi is a reason to feel happy because the thrown away entrails are cooked at his home and is called phasi. Shahu Patole has mentioned this. The revelation that this book created commotion among some middle class readers make one point clear. Some middle class readers who for the first time read something like this, though it was in vernacular, but mostly Maratha-speaking media picked it up and reported the book in media. And that is how I came to know, and then later I have collected a copy of it. It was almost celebrated, publication of this book, because this opened a new door for us, a look into food, improper, unclean food, as has been described not only by the Brahmins, but by authors of modern cookbooks. A window to such dishes, such food practices has been opened by this gentleman, Shahu Patole. Svetlana, this is for your information. I requested Shahu Patole to write a chapter for our book, Food and Power, but he refused. You know why? Because he said, I cannot write in English. I told him that you write in Marathi, I will get it translated, but he is a very shy person. He somehow could not do that. Anyway, so this book has been celebrated by a section of the media as soon as it was published, but now that wave is dead. But my point is, he has opened the door. Let us explore the other world. The revelation that this book created commotion among some middle-class readers makes one point clear. There was no free movement of knowledge of recipes between communities in India, to say nothing about sharing of food. Such a movement is usually restricted between, Appadurai has commented that with publication of cookbooks in vernacular, communities are sharing their ideas and they're coming close. But my critique here is that this publication of this book shows that this communication is very limited among one section of Indian society and not beyond that. Such a movement is usually restricted between unequally placed social groups, and it is not easy to cross the class boundary too. Patole has written his Maratha, it's a middle-ranking caste. His Maratha neighbor sends him food during festivals. He receives gift in form of cooked food from his Maratha neighbor, but it cannot be reciprocated. The Maratha household would not accept food cooked by Sahu Patole's family, which is a monk family. The neighbor sometimes comes to Shahu Patole's house while he likes the food we prepare and sometimes eats at my home. He requests me not to tell anyone that he has dined at my house. It's a secret. That some limited exchange is taking place must be kept secret because it will not be accepted by the, not by the wider society, but by the dominant society. After about 4 decades of India's independence, Appadurai noted rise of a national cuisine that became evident through cookbooks written in English. And especially such cookbooks were written for readers who stay abroad, the overseas Indians. And such books are often compilation of a few South Indian dishes, a few North Indian dishes, a few West Indian dishes, and they call it Indian cookbooks. And they represent Indian national cuisine. Audience of those publications were middle-class urban women who were a large and diverse group. Those books allowed the woman to transcend spatial, this is, I'm quoting Appadurai. Those books allowed the woman to transcend spatial and social boundaries to a certain extent. In a society where dining across caste or ethnic boundaries is still a relatively delicate matter, recipes sometimes move where people may not. In traditional India, wrote Appadurai, commensal boundaries were central to the edifice of the caste system, but the movement of recipes in the new urban middle class milieu is one sign of the loosening of these boundaries, wrote Appadurai. But my point here is, if we go simply by number, we do not still know well how at least a quarter of Indians eat, what they eat, how they process their food and beverage. Because that's a no-go area. There is a no admission board on the other side. So such knowledge cannot enter the other side of the society. But here, when I say there never was any Anna Saṃhita, maybe there was not one treatise, but let there be many such books. And once the door has opened, let us welcome Shahu Patole and others. In the book I have edited, Food and Power, I mentioned some time back, there are 1 or 2 chapters written by members of such communities. For example, one of my friends, he has written on his community, and he has talked about items of food that were relatively unknown to many of us. So let this door open, let there be free movement, if not of persons, but at least of knowledge. We are waiting for that day, and we are working towards that goal. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, dear Kanchan. It's a huge subject, really. It is a wonderful lecture and a lot of ideas you gave to us to discuss. Actually, I have several questions, just few of them. So one thing, the moment you wrote it about this, the idea of absence of Anna Saṃhita, I was thinking about two sources, basically. So one is the Grihya Sutras, so where, of course, they're dedicated to something else. And of course, it's a pure Brahminical point of view as such, but still there are some ideas about the food are there. Maybe they're dispersed and maybe they're too fragmented to make a general picture. But anyway, and another thing is that some kind of Shruta Saṃhita or Charaka Saṃhita, something we discussed actually yesterday, this Ayurveda issue. So maybe these two sources, can you comment a little bit? So what kind of knowledge about the food we have from these two sources, like Ayurvedas and Grihya Sutras?
Svetlana, that's a very good question. And I have told you that we have to understand this entire issue from three axes: Sthana, Kala, and Patra. So time is important. You see here at one point, the ancient Hindus are talking of, if you call them Hindu at all, because the term was not there, whatever, predecessors of the Hindus in ancient times would probably be a better expression. We're talking of eating almost any kind of meat, domesticated animals and hunted animals and birds. It was there. And this whole thing evolved. The ethos, food ethos evolved. And I have very briefly mentioned about the Jain philosophy and Buddhist philosophy of non-violence. When they were becoming popular, even then, Manu Saṃhita was describing different kinds of meat and was ranking them according to preference of Brahmins. It is there. Please remember that these Saṃhitas, these books on medicine and surgery, they are recommending foods that the Hindutva brigade would not allow you to eat inside India. Okay, they were prescribing beef as a food for certain kinds of patients in some diseases and all that. It is there. So I could not elaborate on that. But when time changed, and I have discussed it elsewhere in some detail, it was this stance towards vegetarianism was induced. It was not original. When the Jains and the Buddhists were becoming very popular, then the Brahmins, at least some of the Brahmins, declared themselves to be non-vegetarians. Vegetarians. So there is one opinion that they were simply copying the Jain and Buddhist monks who were becoming, steadfastly, who were becoming very popular in Indian society. So they were emulated. And that was much later. That happened much later. But by the time the books were composed, excepting, of course, Grihasastra and then this Charak Saṃhita and Sushruta Saṃhita, when you come to later period, because I have mentioned Vedic and post-Vedic literature, and these books are contemporary with post-Vedic period. But even later, during Puranic period, you look at it, such books were not being written. Such prescriptions were not being written. And you know the period. That was much later than the period of Upanishads. It was there. So I could not discuss all that in detail. So a major change took place during this Puranic period, and the schools were separate, but they distanced from each other. In Tantra, non-vegetarianism was part of their ritual performances. The Panch Makar and Madhya, Mansa and Matsya are three major components of those five. But think of the other groups like Shaiva. They are different, but then think of the Vaishnavas. And if you look closely at the geographical distribution, you will see the initially the Vaishnavas were very popular in areas where Jainas also were popular. So they shared vegetarianism among them, not to lose their popularity. This is one thing. And you have visited Bali, Svetlana, you have visited Bali, so you will know the Hindus of Bali, they claim themselves to be Shaivites. Disconnection, but I have listened to what Suman was telling, a very pertinent point. And please remind that these texts were modified. It was, I mean, rarely we find them in their original shape, and later some portions were modified, but fortunately some of the older texts was written, and that is how we can get into it, and we can see the whether it is philosophical or whatever, but this transition from one kind of food ethos to another, because I found reasons to challenge this idea, blanket idea of philosophical transition, because at times it was certain ethos were accepted, borrowed, emulated from others just to challenge their popularity. It is the popular form of religious schools that happened, and when they could not merge at one point, they separated from each other. I'll not get into that. There is a political history, whole political history of that how different schools, religious schools, they fought with each other to gain more political power. And the easiest way was to convince the king and convert the king into different schools of religion. There were Tantric kings, there were Vaishnav kings, there were Shaivite kings. Anyway, the point I was narrating was about Bali, the Shaivite Hindus there. Now, in wedding feast, they serve beef, they serve pork there. And I have asked them whether there is any restriction about food practices which is related to religion. So one Hindu gentleman from Bali, and his name is interesting, his name is Shiva. Shiva told me a very interesting thing. He said that there are some pious religious persons who eat beef, but selectively. They would meat of a cow, but not of a bull, because bull is vehicle of Shiva, Nandi. So Nandi cannot be eaten, but Bhagavati can be eaten, whatever. So again, time and space. This migration to Bali, when it took place from eastern coast, in that direction, because you must be knowing that in eastern coast, all along eastern coast, there is a ritual observed every year called Bali Yatra. Starting from Odisha, Andhra to Tamil Nadu, Bali Yatra is performed every year as an annual ritual. When this happened, these food ethos that were taking shape in North was present along Eastern coast. So not just time, the space as well, where these books were being composed, who were the people who were contributing in these scholastic activities, sponsoring such scholastic activities, who were the kings. So it's a very, I told you, it's a very complicated situation, but to put it simply, all these thoughts are coexisting, but certain sections were not allowed to get into the articulate space of Indian society, the Dalits. And if you look back, this is not the first time. If you look back in the play Mrichakatika, there clearly it is being mentioned, and this has been quoted by Ambedkar. It is being clearly mentioned that keep the beef eater Buddhists from your temples. And if you find any Buddhist to enter your temple, clean it immediately. And this adjective, beef eater Buddhists, is being used there. So there is a continuity in this practice. And there was some political rivalry in this practice. It is not for nothing that the Buddhists were called beef eaters and to be given a lowly position. And this continued. And the Maratha Dalit, being led by Ambedkar, embraced Buddhism at a later date. Whether they eat beef or not, that's a different issue. But a circle was completed with that act. I do not know whether I could answer your query, but I shared some of my thoughts.
Sure. And another small, maybe it's actually again a big question, but maybe I will try to make it small. The concept of akrishtapachya, so mentioned by you. So there is a distinction between cultivated food and uncultivated food. So the food which has been taken from forests, such as honey, for instance, akrishtapachya, so something that was produced without a plug, actually. So what is today's concept of it? So how we can find out, the sources for these to become a concept? The status of it. Like in Navratri time, people can eat akrishtapachya or something. Can you just a little bit elaborate on that?
Well, a very good source book for such thoughts is Manu Saṃhita. Okay. But unfortunately, they never explain. They are asking people to eat certain food and they are asking people not to eat certain food, and there is no explanation. But you have to deduce your own. For example, coming to eating pork by Brahmins, Manu says that Brahmins can eat wild pork, wild boar, because that is clean. But don't eat domesticated pig raised by some people in your village, because that is unclean. Probably he was talking of hygiene, that these pigs are raised by poor people in a very unhygienic condition, but in forest it is not so. I told you the cereal that can make your ancestors happy most when offered in form of food is Nibar Dhan, non-cultivated cereals. Okay, it is there. But at some other place, he is making a list of non-cultivated food which a Brahman must not take, like any kind of fungus. That includes mushroom. It's wild and it should be avoided. Now, again, you may try to find some kind of a scientific reasoning in it, because there are hundreds of species of these edible fungus, and some are very poisonous. So probably he is asking people to avoid all such food altogether. We do not know. That is not being told. But there is, and there is one more thing. The thing is, again, the issue of time. This whole treatise was not written at a given point of time. It was written over a very long period by several authors. There is not a single author of such most of these texts. So certain ideas changed in time. So we cannot make a clear distinction between cultivated and non-cultivated food at any given point of time. The situation is, the whole visual is very blurred to us. Some are preferred at one point of time. The same thing is not preferred at another point of time. So that is there. I'll not get into more detail of it, but yes, there are some philosophical underpinnings, undoubtedly. And Nibar is one, but then all over North India, the cereal most preferred by the ancestors is barley. And remember, when they migrated into Western India from Central Asia, their staple was barley. So ancestors always prefer barley as a food. So some historical connections can be there. Even now in upper reaches of Himalaya or in Karakoram range, barley is the staple till date. So that is there.